All right, recording started like usual. I forgot to start the recording. So as a recap for the video, here we are starting our JavaScript review. One thing that we're doing today is opening up two breakout rooms at the start of the lesson as opposed to afterwards, so that anyone who's had these lessons before in the full-time program can jump into breakout rooms to start working on their personal projects. Otherwise, let's jump straight back into JavaScript fundamentals. So if anybody would like to just call these out, what are 5 to 6 of the most primitive data types?
Strings.
Yes, that's one.
Numbers.
Yep, that's two.
Is floats a thing in JavaScript?
It is in C sharp. In JavaScript, I need a refresher.
Okay.
I don't think so. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong.
Is the Boolean in JavaScript?
Yes, Boolean's another one. So there's three.
Numbers.
Yes, that's another one. And I think we need 2 or 3 more.
Undefined and null.
Yes, exactly. I'm not quite sure if I remember what the sixth one was supposed to be, so I think we could leave
It
that.
says arrays, but that
Array.
doesn't.
Do we count? Yes, arrays. Then I guess in that case, you'd also want to include objects.
Yeah, I didn't think of arrays and objects as primitive, but
I thought those were complex. Am I wrong?
yeah, that's how I remember them. But they are listed in the curriculum here. Oh, as data types, not so much breaking out by primitive versus complex in the curriculum.
Okay. But yes, definitely, if you want to make the distinction between primitive and complex, these are 5 to 6. And I am kind of blanking on what that sixth one was supposed to be. Undefined, null. If it comes back to me, come back to me. But yes, one reason that we want to be mindful of data types is for tracking equality. Let's say when you're troubleshooting, right? There is a difference between strict equality and loose equality. And this is generally distinguished by the number of equal signs you use in the operator that you pass in. So if you were to say, for example, null equals undefined, this would return true. But if you use strict equality with 3 equal signs, it would return false. When it comes to how data types are handled, loose equality will usually leave a lot of wiggle room for data type conversions that are triggered by the methods and whatnot that you use. Whereas if you need more precise control, you'll want to use strict equality. Yes, data types could be tricky, especially if you're dealing with things like numbers, right? It's very possible to be passing data along and then you're finding a bug somewhere in your code because you have a number being passed in, but it's being treated like a string and vice versa. So let's see, some more fundamentals about undefined and null. They're essentially both empty values. To be a little more, yeah, they're both indicating an empty value, but there are some differences. Undefined, for example, is defined by default, and null is assigned manually. So use cases for these will vary as well. Undefined can be good for confirming if a variable is untouched and remains in initial state, whereas null can be used to confirm that a null value has been registered. So I guess I already answered why data types matter. that slide. And operators. Operators are used to manipulate expressions. So that could be very simple arithmetic or logical operators that are used to compare quality. We also have operators that can increment or decrement. I think I recall from last week when we were going over one of the bash challenges, we saw a case where plus equals was not working in the bash script. It may have had something to do with the use of double square brackets. It's kind of hazy for me right now, but be mindful of like these very slightly different behaviors, right? There's a difference between using or returning the result of like two values added together versus a value that's incrementing, because the value that's incrementing will update essentially the state of the original variable that's assigned to, whereas the other will not. It will just return the output of the equation. So yes, we talked about loose quality and strict equality. Right. One of the key differences basically is strict equality will not leave any room for data conversions that are being managed by whatever methods you use. Let's see. We have operators. We have logical operators like and or, which are using these symbols and the output of some of these combinations. For example, if we were to say if something is true and not true. Oh, I think I was supposed to ask, what would be returned by this? I'm gonna open up my terminal just so I can double check. That's actually a good idea. I forgot to mention this. So for those of you, anyone really actually, feel free to open up a terminal, hop inside a Node.js environment and start playing around with some of these data types and operators. So right now, if we were to hop inside of Node.js and say along the lines of try to shrink this down a bit. Oh, it keeps doing that. All right, there we go. So I'm in my Node.js. If I were to say something like some Boolean equals true and not true, what do you think I would get as a result?
Not true.
Let's see. Exactly, we get a false value. And if we were to do true and not false, I would think that we would get a true value. Let's find out. Oops. Yep, it returns true. And finally, true or not false. What should this return? True. We have one guess for true. Let's find out. All right. You all understand your operators. Okay, what do we have here? What are the two most common collection data types? Already sort of been answered earlier in class, but let's hear another solution.
Strings and integers.
Is that what I have?
Actually, I don't know. I was multitasking, so guilty.
Well, it's all good because I think Cass, I think it was you that pointed out arrays and objects earlier anyway. So
Ah, complex though versus simple. Sorry, you're right. Okay.
Right on. So what are the differences between arrays and objects? Troy.
In JavaScript, between arrays and objects, I'm going to have to shoot with some type of structure on the backside. So in the list versus a more structured format. And I'm trying to catch up to speed with you guys. So I'm doing a bit of research as we're talking on these topics.
When you say structure, Troy, are you referring to something specific like, let's say, indexes?
Oh, yeah, that would be an interesting way to do it. Yep. I was not, but I wasn't referring to anything specific outside of, maybe an unordered, right? Now you got me thinking unordered list versus an indexed object.
Right on. Yeah, well, I think that's just how I like to think about arrays and objects. The key difference for them being one is indexed and the other is not. Objects are essentially just key value pairs. And if you wanted to iterate through these objects, you would use, in JavaScript, you have access to some special for loops like for in and for of. You could also use enumerate to iterate through an object or a dictionary in Python. So let's see, talk about conditionals. Natalia, what are conditionals?
Conditions are structures that check if some conditions are true or not and perform some actions if they're true or not, depending on the goal.
Definitely. Conditionals are used to check for, let's say, things like equality and validity, and they're basically fundamental to control flow. So if else expressions, while expressions. I might need to update this slide deck because I think while does not belong.
While is a loop, right?
What was that?
While is a loop, right?
Exactly. Yep, that looks like just an error on my part. So yes, ways to iterate would be for loops, while expressions. There are more ways to do that. Tomorrow, for example, we're going to be covering higher order functions and or recursion. It is a lot to throw at once, so I don't expect you all to get through both of those lessons in one day. But again, we're essentially flying by the seat of our pants here. This material is normally covered over 3 weeks in the full stack curriculum, and we're essentially trying to squeeze a good chunk of that in 1 week here. Fortunately, we are not going to be testing for this in any of the assessments. The very first assessment you all will have will be during the AWS module, but this is still super foundational to everything you'll need to know as a DevOps engineer. You can't operate, well, you can't operate as a DevOps engineer without knowing how to develop. You sort of can, like, let's say maybe as a sysadmin or whatnot, but the more you understand developing, the better position you'll be overall. And when it comes to job interviews, everyone's favorite thing, I know, algorithms are going to be a big part of how companies test for your knowledge. And so while we may not be covering this week's challenges, next week's challenges, in an assessment, I definitely encourage you all to revisit this week's material throughout the curriculum, just to brush up and get practice in algorithms, to become more comfortable with them, to become more comfortable with whiteboarding challenges. So when time comes that you are interviewing and you are going through these live, you don't choke, you don't second guess yourself, and you don't doubt yourself too much. All right, data types. Just a quick recap, different data types are handled differently. Arithmetic operators will yield numerical data types, while logical operators yield Booleans. Ooh, that book. Yeah, I haven't read that book myself yet. Cass just mentioned a book called Grokking Algorithms in the chat, but that's been recommended before. It might have even been recommended in the last DevOps class. If Chad was here, he might start talking about it, but Chad.
Yeah, or Adam. I mean, I said put down. Yeah, it was Adam, not Chad. Adam mentioned it in Full Stack, and so I've been actually like collecting books on Kindle, and I've cracked it, looked at it, haven't read it, but it does appear to be very user friendly and to explained in ways that I will understand. So it does look like a good book with humor written in.
Right on. I need to finally get around and check it out myself. But yes, definitely a good recommendation. Looks like we have a +1 for it. Great for the visualizations in that book. We should have a bookmark, I think, for as a list of resources, a document listing out all these resources. I'll start to collect some of the stuff that's been recommended over these past few weeks and place them all into a single document that I could bookmark into the Slack channel. All right, a few more slides to get through, talking about conditionals, more complex data structures like stacks, so first in, last out, etc., and queues. These are things that we're not really covering heavily inside the DevOps curriculum, but I think it's definitely still good to learn about in preparation for job interviews. And then we talk a bit about control flow. The more complex the data structure, the more control flow and freedom you have in implementing behaviors. Not sure I remember why I wrote that. All right, let's see. I think that's it. Or no, we have a few more things. Statements and expressions. Okay, that's pretty much the same thing. They're just kind of like, it's just kind of like semantic difference between the two. Individual characters. Again, something that you don't really think about, but something that might be important to remember when you're working with regex. And finally, the differences between Node.js and in the browser. For the most part, you're not going to experience too many differences between the two. I would say the biggest difference is that JavaScript compiled in a browser has to abide by additional policies, right? So cross-origin request sharing, for example. This is a policy implemented in web browsing that prevents the transferring of data via API between different websites. And if you're making a request from, let's say, your local environment from Node.js, you don't have to worry about that. But if you're making an API request from a browser, you will have to worry about that. The website that you're trying to hit will likely have to have your API URL or the URL of your application, wherever you're making this API call from. It will have to have that marked as a valid origin. Aside from that, when you start working in React, you'll have access to things like DOM and just document elements that basically don't really apply to a Node.js scenario where you're not working inside a browser. And finally, this is just some reminders that I'm pretty sure you've all heard before. Things like how pseudocoding is helpful, keeping your code dry is just good practice. Be mindful of code complexity and efficiency, especially for algorithm challenges. And coding solutions that are easy to read, follow, and understand are practical and more value than abstract creative solutions that require a lot of mental gymnastics for your teammates and potential employers to understand. If you get stuck, remember to keep it simple and don't underestimate the value of rubber ducking, which is essentially just talking through your code out loud, because it forces you to break things down into sensible, digestible steps. Any questions about the JavaScript overview? Cool. That's pretty much all I've got. Let's take a 15-minute break and we will reconvene at 9 to do some code reviews. We'll try to get some code reviews probably from the challenges today. It might be too early to ask folks to share some of the code from their personal projects, but throughout the week, as you work on your projects, look for opportunities to have something to share. I think that'd be pretty cool to have some sneak peeks at your projects during stand down or at the start of class. With that, let's cut the recording and